we're talking about fiction set during the time of the Cold War, I thought I'd get a little classier with it. We have a... what the fuck is this? It's a gift of whiskey from my 21st. The note inside says, "Fuck, you're old now, cunt." Thank you to the friend of mine who bought this. I know it must have set you back a cruel $15. Delectable. I'm feeling classy enough to, rat out West Germany. Right, we're doing the 5th book that I've read on the International Booker shortlist for this year, and we're getting quite close to the winner announcement, and this is the one that I got the most kind of requests for. I think it's the one with the most reads on Goodreads. I can't be fucked to check. And that book is Jenny Erpenbeck's Kairos. Kairos is about a relationship between a woman named Katerina and a man named Hans, and Katerina's about 15 and Hans is about 80. And they fuck a bunch, and then they whine, and while that's happening, it's the lead up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and all of the crazy East Germany, West Germany shit that's happening at the same time. But the reason that this book is kind of unique is that it builds this relationship of this couple with a big age gap arguing, and a lot of its focus and structure is built around these endlessly flowing, almost aggressively placed cultural references and artistic references, and it spams you with culture shit about Berlin at the time and East Germany at the time and other shit, and it just keeps hitting you with it during this relationship that's happening. That's kind of the book's claim to fame, as it were. And giving you this crazy sweep of, like, historical references and so on is interesting, but it's also monstrously hit or miss to me. And I like the book overall, but I'm not entirely sure I think I love it. It's not like for every great moment in the book there's a bad moment. It's more like for every great moment in the book there's like 30 or 40 pages where I was just not paying attention. Because the flow was just so intense and it was just sort of like fucking like knocking me out, and I was not paying attention to any of the shit I was supposed to. For a great moment, for example, is when these two people fuck for the first time, and when they do that, it's like set to sort of choral music, and there's all these sort of instances of Christian imagery while they're fucking, and that was like a legitimately incredible moment. It was some John Fosse type shit. And I thought that was great. I thought that bit in particular was really well written, and I didn't write down a quote because to show you how good that part would be, I just showed the whole thing. So the quality is often in the writing and the pace and the structure of it, but it's also sometimes in the plot itself. Another moment that I really loved is when the couple are on a nudist beach, and the old guy is talking about how he was in the Hitler Youth, because he's kind of a remnant from the Hitler era, which is part of his character. And he says, "I was in the Hitler Youth and I loved it." And so I thought that was a great moment too. And that conversation that they have is really good as well. There's a lot of historical connection in this book that gets quite overbearing. And there's a lot that the author does to implant these two characters who are fucking and fighting really deeply into their environment, so deeply that we can't even find them at points. And that kind of like total implanting of the characters it creates a really interesting effect. So there's a lot of moments where you're reading a section and it's just like name after name and place after place, and then the two characters pop up doing some shit, and they just kind of like step out of the environment and they step out of the unrelated passage, and I found that really effective almost every time it happened. Here's kind of a quote of that to give an example. "A woman collects tokens from the German-Soviet Friendship Society and pastes them down in her membership booklet, and a man wonders what he can do to support his tomato plants. At this great time, Hans holds Katerina's mouth closed." And it's like, whoa, where the fuck did the characters come from? You know, like, they'll just step out. They'll just come out of nowhere, and it's really interesting. And that kind of character being totally subsumed by environment reminded me a lot of Cold War, the Pawlikowski movie. And that's kind of the closest comparison I'd give to this book. I felt like the author choices changed throughout the book in terms of how the author would kind of give meaning. For example, there's one thing I noted down, I think it was around page 60, that's just a full page of Katerina watching Hans walk around his apartment and just touching things and moving things around. And it's just described in very sort of specific detail as he picks up a pot and puts it down. And I really loved that choice, and it was really effective, and it said a lot about Katerina's character, but the book never did anything like that again. But as I said, it's hit or miss because it's crazy choices and crazy amounts of reference being thrown at you from all sides. One part at the end when the author talks about how Katerina is no longer horny, and then she digresses into talking about DNA and hormones in general, and I felt the strain in the writing there. I felt like she was trying to keep up with the pace she'd set for herself at that point in particular, And I was like, you could just say she isn't horny. You don't have to go, she isn't horny. Now we'll talk about the molecules inside her body. Like, it's not adding anything. After a certain point, it's just not adding anything more. And as much as I love the density of the writing in theory and its ability to kind of impact the way we view the characters, I felt like it dampened the elegance of the central metaphor at some points in time. Fucking hell, that was a pretentious sentence, Jesus. Yes, very good. If the central metaphor being that perhaps this relationship represents the tumultuous time that they're living in, I don't know if that works or if the endless stream of references and fucking throwing your head around to read the book. I don't know which of those works better, but I feel like both can't exist at the same time. I just think generally the book clutters itself a lot. And I think the book just needed to let some of the images breathe a little more. I still like the kind of kaleidoscopic focus, and I still like how much it's doing. It just needed to space it out a little more and maybe just let me breathe a little bit. Because the moments where I'm really remembering the writing are like individual moments. They're not tied into anything. I'm just remembering a scene and I'm not thinking about the plot at that point or how the character's feeling at that point, or at least not really. It's just like, that was a good bit of writing, but I don't know if that's how a book should be, as a series of like, just a bombardment of shit where sometimes you go, oh, that was pretty good. Like, I don't know if that works. It'd create a greater investment if the book was either longer and more spaced out or shorter with less shit in it. Because other than that, it's watching these two unlikable characters sort of just declutter their environment. They just suffer each other's company through the pinwheeling machinations of whatever the author comes up with for them to look at or for them to remember, you know? It's fucking crazy. Often the central metaphor is baked into locational storytelling. So there's examples I remember, like, there's a moment where Erpenbeck mentions a currency crash, and then after the currency crash is mentioned, there's a scene where tables and chairs and furniture are all thrown out of houses, and I thought that was a really good image. Like, all the furniture goes out of the house, and so on, when there's a currency crash, and the characters are walking through that while they're talking. And I was like, that's a fucking awesome image in my head to have of that happening. So sometimes it does that, and again, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just Hans remembers a melody, and then we get like an italicized section of him thinking about classical music, you know? Or like the lyrics to a song, and I'm like, if you just take those out, what's removed from the story? If you just take out an entire stanza of a song, what's left? It's kind of like your typical historical romance at the end of the day, but the writing is more frenetic, and the environment sits over the characters in a more oppressive way through the writing. It is interesting and it is crazy, and it's just my personal preference in saying that I don't know if it entirely works the whole time for me. The book is very claustrophobic and very hard to follow at points. There's a lot of discussion of music that I couldn't give a shit about, and I don't think it helps that the relationship at the core is not especially complicated. You kind of know how Katerina is going to be in the first 30 pages, and you kind of know that the relationship is going to turn abusive just from kind of their first interactions, and that's a good thing because it means the characters are really defined, but I never really felt like the book was doing something unique with the relationships. I was always like, Katerina's gonna have some kind of like sense of Hans as like this beautiful hero man, and the second he starts sort of repelling her, she's gonna descend into self-loathing and so on. I kind of got that feeling, and that is what happened. Obviously the character grows beyond that, but yeah, I felt like the relationship structure of they meet, they fuck, honeymoon phase, one of them cheats on the other, abuse and guilt tripping, and then they drift apart. I was like, yeah, that's like, there's a lot of relationships that have gone like that. And the fact that it's used as a metaphor means that it's okay because the relationship is maybe not to be taken so literally. But even so, I felt like the relationship was quite boring, and the back half of this book, when Hans is just guilt-tripping her, got really repetitive, and I'm sure it felt repetitive to be in that relationship too, but either way, I was kind of just checking out. The book did a good job setting up how characters would react to things later on, like how Katerina would react because she's put so much of herself onto Hans. So when he rejects her, as I said, she goes into self-loathing. So the characters did feel defined, if not especially complex by the end of the day. There's lots of little quirks in the relationship that I like. I really love his interest in her innocence and how that's connected to like the time that he grew up in and how he kind of used to be a Hitler Youth. And he's interested in that innocence, and he has these sort of like vaguely sadistic thoughts in his head. I like that. That was a good choice. That might have been my favorite part of the metaphor. So it's sort of quirks like that, but the relationship itself was not kind of built on any unique foundation to me. And their relationship just kind of disintegrates and falls out of focus in a way I thought was quite realistic. And it becomes harder to track if they're together or not by the end of the book, which I think I like, but again, just the general obsession the author has with throwing cultural references at you meant that the drift apart that they feel is something that I was already feeling a lot at the beginning because I was finding it hard to track what was happening. So yeah, I don't know. As I've said, I wish that there was more space to breathe because all of this tangential writing with all of these flurry of references at you is kind of interesting at the beginning, but I was checking out by the final third of the book. And it does do a good job illustrating the socio-political environment the characters are in, even if it leaves no stone unturned at all in regards to that. It was just some restraint I was looking for to make it a little more digestible. That's really it at the end of the day. Like, just a small amount of restraint. Because the times when the author does show restraint and eases up and comes back to focus on the relationship were usually the best parts in the book. But yeah, I'm not reading it for the plot, and I don't like the plot. I really don't like the twist in the epilogue, so vague spoilers for Kairos. But the twist at the end where it turns out Hans was, I think, a spy, or I think like someone that was having tabs kept on him or something. I don't know why the fuck that mattered, because by the end of the book, I do not feel compelled to reread the book and go, oh, there's gonna be so many subtleties that Katerina was actually dating a spy. Like, at that point in time in the book, it did not matter. It totally did not matter for him to be revealed as a spy. It's kind of a conclusion of the metaphor, and there's a couple of final lines that illustrate that it's a conclusion of the metaphor. But having it baked in this, like, plot sort of, like, reveal, like, oh, Hans was a spy, I don't think it created the effect that Erpenbeck was intending for it to create. It just made me go, okay, and like that doesn't affect the rest of the book for you to do that. It's just like a full stop on the metaphor, but it comes at you in a way that's like a plot reveal. So it's weird. I also didn't feel like the metaphor was especially clean cut. And I felt like the lines blurred a lot. Is one of them meant to represent East Germany and one of them meant to represent West? Is it an idealism thing? Is it something about their past? Is it where they've lived? Is it just the relationship itself and the sort of like fraught kind of abusive power in a relationship that's meant to illustrate that? The metaphor itself becomes quite muddy, and I like that because it feels like there's more to untangle, but again, considering how crazy and frenetic the book is, it's not something I feel particularly compelled to read into. A lot of it just went over my head, and maybe a reread would improve that, but as I've said, I'm not compelled to reread it. I feel like I got what I wanted out of the book, and even if there's more there, it's kind of it would be kind of suffering through a really sort of intense flurry of viewpoints and an intense just sort of barrage of references, be they cultural, historical, or political. And I found it very hard to trace a central metaphor or even characters at points in this book. It's intentionally headache-inducing, it's intentionally confusing at points. She definitely wrote the book she wanted to write. It's just not entirely for me, although there are some parts that I really loved, and it is hit or miss. It's a whirlwind of imagery, and I got about 50% of that, maybe less. But I love some of the writing, and I think she's a very talented author. I'd give the book a 6 out of 10, just kind of on my personal belief. It might go up to a 7, but I think a 6 out of 10 is fair. I do like the book. I did like it more in the first half, and my attention dwindled. So I would say a 6 out of 10, and I don't think my perspective will change too much. Thank you all. Leave a like if the age gap between you and your significant other is older than 30 years. Cheers all. This fucking sucks, so the things I do for you. Bye!